Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is a fantastic organisation that works very hard to promote animal studies and to support animal studies scholars. So please, if you're interested in animal studies, think about joining ASA. ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, you can find them online at their website or at Facebook. Now, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from Mexico City, and I'm here to attend the Mining Animals Conference. It's quite early in the morning on the first day of the conference, and I'm getting some bright and early podcast participants. So today I'm lucky to be joined by Mary Trachsel. Now, I just practiced that surname and then probably forgot it. Did I get that right? No.
Trachsel.
Mary Trachsel. Now, Mary is an associate professor at the University of Iowa. And today we will discuss Mary's recent book chapter titled The Presence of Pork and the Absence of Pigs, Changing Stories of Pigs and People in Iowa. And the chapter appears in a book that's edited by David Nibert titled Animal Oppression and Capitalism, which was published by Praeger, is that right? Praeger Press in 2017. So welcome to the podcast, Mary.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So Mary, can you start by telling us why you wrote this chapter?
I think I'd been wanting to write this chapter for a long time. It's in the center of the piece is a personal story about my relationship with a very special pig in my youth. And I have a lot of guilt feelings about what happened to that pig. His name was Wilbur, after the pig in Charlotte's Web. And I had not been able to write about him, although I have thought about him a lot throughout my life. So this was an opportunity to do that.
So you grew up in Iowa and you grew up very much in pig raising, pig farming country. Can you say something about how that influenced your thinking about pigs?
Well, my father was a farmer, and this was before farming really changed to become much more concentrated and much more industrial. So my brothers and I had very close relationships with all the farm animals because we helped take care of them. And now there are many, many more pigs in the state than there used to be when I was living on the farm. And I can kind of feel the presence of these, 23 million pigs living in really deplorable conditions all around me. Just because I did have that very personal relationship with them when I was young.
So is there something particular that's happening in Iowa in relation to pig farming, or could this story be told in a lot of different contexts? How central is Iowa?
Well, Iowa is the number one pork-producing state in the United States. So it's the place, this is happening everywhere, not just in the United States, but in South America and I think in Europe. So pigs are being kept in large confinement buildings. They are genetically modified to basically just grow fat and get to market weight faster. So they have very unnatural lives. It's happening everywhere, but in Iowa it's particularly acute because we're the biggest pork-producing state in the nation. And probably in the world.
And is there debate among the community in Iowa about the impact of this pork production or the impact of having so many pigs living in such a small area?
Yeah. People who live close to these confinement, they're called CAFOs, They suffer from the air pollution. The water in Iowa is very polluted because you can imagine with 23 million pigs, the amount of manure that they produce, and that ends up going into the waterways. So it's an environmental and public health problem as well as just a moral problem.
So you're very critical of the invisibility of pigs. Can you say something about the different forces that you've identified that work to make pigs invisible, say, to the community?
There are large commercial organizations, the Iowa Pork Producers, the National Pork Producing Association, the Farm Bureau. There are these large commercial organizations that work very hard to keep pigs out of the public eye. It's easier to sell your product if people don't know where it comes from. So in Iowa and in other states as well, there are what we call gag-ag laws, and these are laws that prevent people from making recordings, video recordings, audio recordings of conditions inside of pork-producing CAFOs or slaughterhouses. And I think that people who who infiltrate are actually considered domestic terrorists because it's a threat to the food supply.
You're also very critical of the corporatization of pork production. What is it about the corporations being involved in the production of pigs and pig meat that you find problematic?
I guess because I know pigs personally, it seems a great shame that they are treated so impersonally. They're very intelligent, they're very companionable, personable animals. So it seems even worse that animals like that are treated with such, like they're objectified. So that makes it seem even worse because they are so intelligent and so emotional.
And so speaking of emotions, one of the other things that you argue in the chapter is about the use of, you're critical of the use of logical or detached logic when critiquing animal suffering or trying to get people interested in the animal issues in a very detached, rational way. Can you say something about why you think it's important to engage empathetically when talking about animals?
Maybe it's because it's the way I engage. That's probably, first of all, why I think that's important. But I think that people don't really care how other animals are treated if it's a logical problem. But if you're invested, if you're personally invested in another animal, then the motivation is very different to change things for that animal.
And can you see any move away from, say, pork farming, or can you imagine a time when Iowa doesn't have so many pigs living there?
Well, it's easy for me to imagine it, but to believe that is going to actually happen is more difficult. We're very heavily economically invested in pork production in my state. And large corporations control probably 95% of the pork production in the state. So it is a real challenge to try to crack that monolith. But I do think that you are starting to see, there's a very famous pig named Esther. I think she lives up in Canada, and Esther has a Facebook page, and there are postings about her and things like that. I think bring to the public a different view of pigs that I think is very positive, that people can see them as something other than food or victims.
So what are the main messages that you're hoping readers of your chapter will take away from your contribution to the book?
I guess I wish that people who read my chapter would get to know some pigs, make an effort to, visit a farm sanctuary, and find out for yourself what really lovely animals they are.
Wonderful. Well, Mary, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I think it was probably novels. I think, it was reading things like Charlotte's Web and Old Yeller, and my background is in English literature, and so it was novels, really. Black Beauty, certainly.
Yeah, I can remember Black Beauty very well from my childhood also. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
The first thing I ever wrote was an article for a phenomenology conference, and it was about the concept of living with, which is from the philosopher Husserl. And I was interested in living with other species.
So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think it would be Sue Savage-Rumbaugh, who has done ape language studies. And that was, as a language scholar, that was my first entry into scholarship on animals.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think that we can open up and embrace non-academic ways of knowing animals. I'm really interested in how animal handlers, animal trainers know animals, and I think that we have a lot to learn from what I call rustic authorities.
Fascinating. So, Mary, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I guess it would be that we would escape our human exceptionalism, our sense that people are special and are set apart from the rest of nature, really, and could see other animals as subjects like ourselves.
So, Mary, what are you working on next?
I am interested in how we treat the animals and how that affects the environment. So I'm interested in environmental studies and the place of animal studies within environmental studies.
And is there something, a particular piece that you're working on?
I am, and it's coming rather slowly, so it's not in publication yet.
Okay. So how can people find out more about your work?
I don't know. I guess they could Google me. I guess they could, I've published in a variety of places, Animals in Society, but Google my name.
Yeah, Google Scholar. And do you have a university web page at your university?
I do, and it's at uiowa.edu.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast, where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at so_s. We also have a Facebook page, which is Knowing Animals. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, don't forget to leave a review for us on iTunes. Reviews mean that we become more easily searchable on iTunes, and it means that other people can find the podcast and learn about animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.